Welcome to Tony Byrne's View with news you can use. Tony has over 32 years of experience as a chartered financial planner and wealth manager. Tony's passion is to help you retire early and live the life of your dreams with no financial worries. Now to today's episode.
Sometimes, when it sounds too good to be true, it really is. On a number of occasions in this podcast series, I've voiced my cynicism of successive governments' stealth tax policies. However, sometimes the government does surprise you with unexpectedly generous tax legislation, which may be intentional but is most likely accidental, usually because the legislation is passed very hurriedly. I was never a great fan of George Osborne, who struck me as the stereotypically aloof, upper-class, ex-public schoolboy Tory. However, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, I did like his radical impact taxation policies. Shortly before he departed his post as Chancellor, he left us with an absolute gift known as pensions freedoms, which came into effect in April 2015. The main change was to allow individuals to access as much of their personal pension as they felt fit, even as much as 100% of it. Extraordinary but true. He also swept away the requirement to buy an annuity by age 75. These are amazing and liberating reforms which were well overdue for personal pensions. For the first time, the government was willing to treat people as adults who could be trusted to manage their own personal pensions. Personally, I welcomed the changes with open arms. Why? Because I had always disliked the requirement to buy an annuity by age 75, which meant that your hard-earned pension would one day die with you. I did not see why your pension fund should be gifted to a pension provider on your death. After all, it is your money when all is said and done. The ability to withdraw your whole pension fund is, on the face of it, potentially dangerous and reckless. But when you realise there is a heavy tax penalty to do this, you find that very few people will ever exercise this option in practice. That's because only 25% of your personal pension is tax-free. The rest of the money withdrawn from your personal pension is added to your taxable income for the year. So unless it is a small pension, you could pay taxation on 3/4 of your pension at income tax rates of up to 45%. Surely that is a prohibitive enough rate of taxation to deter all but the most determined of people from depleting their pension funds 100%. In the last 5+ years, I haven't had a single client withdraw their entire pension fund, nor am I ever likely to experience such a situation. In fact, after 34 years of advising, I can proudly say no client of mine has ever depleted his or her pension fund 100%, and not one of them has ever come close to doing so. Long may it continue. However, the relaxing of the compulsory purchase of an annuity by age 75 has brought some interesting consequences. Unfortunately, the government decided to keep the age 75 deadline primarily to boost tax revenues that would otherwise have been lost by the non-purchase of an annuity. So if you live beyond age 75 and then die, the pension you leave to your spouse and or descendants, such as your children, will become subject to income tax at the marginal rate payable by each beneficiary. Inheritance tax will not be payable though. If, on the other hand, you die before 75, your pension will be inherited by your beneficiaries totally tax-free for the rest of their lives. The pension can be passed down the generations tax-free too. Now, before you get too excited about this, of course, none of us want to die early, and dying before age 75, especially if you're in good health, physically and mentally, is not something that most of us would wish on ourselves or on others. Nonetheless, it does happen, and it happens frequently, so you must be aware of this rule. It gets even better. The inherited pension never counts towards yours or your descendants' lifetime allowance either. And that's regardless of whether you die before or after age 75. This is an extraordinarily generous tax rule because the lifetime allowance is now over £1 million. Does this sound good to be true? Well, of course, but in this case, it really is true, that is. Let me illustrate this with an example. Let's say David is age 74 and dies leaving a personal pension worth £1 million to his wife, Louise, who is age 69. Louise herself has a personal pension worth £500,000. David's pension value is assessed against the lifetime allowance of £1,073,100 because it is known as a benefit crystallisation event, or a BCE for short. As the £1 million is below the lifetime allowance limit, his pension is not subject to income tax on his death, nor is it subject to inheritance tax because pensions are generally free of inheritance tax on death. Louise enjoys a tax-free income of £20,000 a year for the next 5 years from David's pension she inherited before she unfortunately dies, coincidentally, at the same age of 74. So by this time, the combined pensions of hers and David's, after taking this income of £20,000 a year, are now worth £1,750,000. £1,100,000 the widow's inherited personal pension from her departed husband, David, and £650,000 from her own personal pension. So even though the combined pensions are worth comfortably in excess of the lifetime allowance of £1,073,100, neither of them become subject to taxation. Her widow's pension of £1.1 million isn't included in the calculation, and her own personal pension is only worth £650,000 on her death, which is way short of the lifetime allowance as well. Louise's 2 adult children, Ben and Mary, aged 49 and 51 respectively, each inherit tax-free pensions worth £875,000. That's £1,750,000 coming from Louise, which includes her late husband's pension of £1.1 million and hers of £650,000. So £1.75 million divided by 2 is £875,000 each to Ben and Mary. They inherit this money for the rest of their lives, which they in turn may pass on to their own 4 children, then grandchildren, ad infinitum. Could these pensions ever become subject to taxation? Well, surprisingly, the answer is no. As mentioned earlier, this is an extraordinary tax-free benefit for generations to come. And I'm sure it was an unintentional gift by George Osborne. I somehow find I am now rather fond of this Tory toff. Maybe he's not such an unlikable person as I first thought. Or maybe I'm just a hypocrite who is easily bought. Sadly, I'm probably the latter. If, of course, either David or Louise had died after age 75, then all bets would have been off. Each of their pensions would still have been inherited by their children free of inheritance tax, but they would have suffered income tax at their marginal rates on any withdrawals from them. A relatively small price to pay, I would prefer. Nonetheless, both inherited pensions would continue to not be included in the lifetime allowance calculation of the beneficiaries, meaning that each of them could build separate pension pots of up to £1,073,100 before becoming liable to a lifetime allowance tax charge. Their remaining inherited £875,000 each of personal pensions plus growth will never suffer such taxation. So why is this so important? Well, the lifetime allowance tax charge is imposed on the excess amount above the lifetime allowance limit at rates of 55% on lump sums and 25% additional income tax on income from pensions. In my opinion, this is an exorbitant tax penalty for those unlucky enough to ever have to pay it. This tax break on inherited personal pensions is so great, you really need to be aware of it. If your spouse, parent, other relative or friend leaves you a pension on their death as the beneficiary, it is up to you to ensure that you elect to inherit the pension in the right manner. You could simply take the death benefit wholly as a tax-free cash lump sum, but the downside is that once the money is in your estate, it is fully subject to all taxes. Alternatively, you could convert it into an annuity with or without a tax-free cash lump sum. Potentially better still would be to inherit the pension as an income drawdown pension, which would mean that it would be fully tax-free if the deceased died before age 75, or subject to income tax only if the death were after age 75. This latter choice, after deceased inheritance post age 75, would be the best approach if saving inheritance tax were your number one priority. So, whilst the inheritance of a personal pension is a fantastic tax-reduced stroke tax-free benefit, it remains important to take professional advice from a pension specialist to ensure that you take your pension benefits in the most beneficial way to suit your own personal circumstances. In this highly complex world of pensions, you know it makes sense.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share it with your friends and family. For more information, head to www.wealthandtax.co.uk.